It doesn't dominate headlines like politics, but it decides what ends up on your plate. And sometimes it decides a nation's power. America is talking about farm bailouts again, $12 billion, and now calls for $10 billion more. Yet the aggregate numbers tell a different story. Projected farm income for 2025 is near nominal record highs. Land values keep rising, credit conditions remain stable, bankruptcies are up but barely. So who is right? Are farmers sounding the alarm because they are truly hurting? Or is the system masking a quieter structural crisis? If you want to understand how a trade war can crush soybean prices overnight, and why losing an export market is not a temporary shock but a multi-year wound, stay with me. And if this kind of clear, unsentimental analysis matters to you, take a moment to subscribe now. Because in the next part, we confront the central truth. This is not one American agriculture. It is two. To see it clearly, we need to slow the picture down and separate the headlines from the mechanics. When people talk about US agriculture, they talk as if it's a single organism. It isn't. It's a collection of very different sectors moving at very different speeds. On one side are the headline numbers: total farm income, land values, debt ratios, government payments, tens of billions of dollars flowing in each year. On paper, this sector looks resilient, even healthy, but paper hides friction. What matters to farmers day to day is not aggregate income. It's cash flow, what they earn from selling crops, versus what they pay for fertilizer, fuel, and energy. And that balance has shifted sharply. Since 2022, prices for major crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, have fallen hard. Input costs have not. Margins are being squeezed from both sides. At the same time, other producers, livestock and dairy, are experiencing the opposite dynamic. High output prices, low feed costs, strong margins. This divergence is not noise. It's the core of the story, because once we understand how this split emerged, we can understand why today's tension didn't start this year. It was set in motion long before. To understand how we got here, we have to go back, not to a single decision, but to a sequence. In 2022, US agriculture experienced a shock in the opposite direction. Prices surged, global supply chains were strained, energy prices spiked, war disrupted grain flows. Farm revenues hit record highs, but cycles never freeze. As global production adjusted, commodity prices began to fall. Corn, wheat, soybeans all moved sharply downward. The market corrected, costs did not. Fertilizer prices peaked in 2022, then eased, but not proportionally. Energy costs remained elevated. Labor costs climbed and stayed there. Interest rates rose, increasing the cost of operating debt. So farmers entered a familiar but dangerous phase of the cycle: falling output prices, sticky input costs. Historically, this is where private markets force painful adjustments. Margins compress, debt stress builds, land values soften. But this time, something intervened. Government support expanded dramatically, not through traditional farm bills alone, but through supplemental payments, trade war compensation, pandemic relief, emergency assistance layered on top of emergency assistance. The result was stability without clarity. The system absorbed the shock, but it also blurred the signal, making it harder to see where risk was actually accumulating. And that sets the stage for the first real rupture. The rupture didn't begin with weather or with yields. It began with policy colliding with markets. When tariffs went up, agriculture became collateral damage. Not symbolically. Mathematically, China responded first. Counter tariffs targeted US, soybeans, sorghum, meat, cotton. The largest buyer in the world narrowed its door overnight. Prices reacted immediately. Futures fell, basis widened. Farmers watched values drop before a single bushel was harvested. In the short term, the damage looked manageable. Lost exports meant lower prices. Lower prices triggered compensation. Billions flowed in to stabilize incomes. But markets remember, Brazil expanded production to fill the gap. Supply chains adjusted. Infrastructure followed trade, not loyalty. By the time the dust settled, the math had changed. 1S market share in China shrank dramatically. Brazil's grew. This wasn't a pause. It was a transfer. And here's the deeper problem. Once buyers reorganize supply, they don't rush back. Trust is rebuilt slowly. Market share even slower. If this analysis helps you see what headlines miss, stay with me. Because next, we go beneath the surface to the mechanisms quietly locking these outcomes in place. What locks these outcomes in is not politics. It's structure. Agricultural trade runs on reliability, price matters, but predictability matters more. Buyers don't build supply chains around one good year. They build them around years of consistency. Once tariffs enter the system, risk is repriced. Importers hedge. They diversify. They redesign logistics so no single country becomes indispensable. That is the hidden mechanism. When US exports slow, product doesn't disappear. It flows elsewhere. Third countries absorb excess supply. Those countries then protect their own markets, sometimes with tariffs of their own. The result is congestion without coordination. At home, another mechanism compounds the effect. Government payments stabilize income, but not competitiveness. They support balance sheets. They do not rebuild market share. And over time, that support capitalizes into land values, higher payments, higher asset prices, higher barriers to entry. The system looks stable, but it's becoming more rigid, less adaptive, more dependent on intervention. That's the paradox. The safety net prevents collapse, but it also dulls the signals that tell producers and policymakers where the system is truly weakening. And when those signals finally break through, they don't arrive gently. The second rupture doesn't come from exports. It comes from inside the system. Look at the balance sheets, and everything seems fine. Assets are high, debt ratios are low, land values keep climbing. But cash tells a different story. For crop producers, margins are thin or negative. Prices are down, costs stay elevated, operating loans roll over at higher interest rates. Livestock producers, meanwhile, are doing well. Feed is cheap. Meat and dairy prices are strong. Their cash flow holds, so stress concentrates. It doesn't spread evenly. That's when tension builds. Between sectors, between generations, between those who own land and those who rent it. Younger farmers feel it first. Entry becomes nearly impossible. Expansion requires leasing, not ownership. And leasing transfers risk without building equity. This is not a collapse. It's worse. It's a slow compression, one that doesn't show up in national statistics, one that feels manageable until it isn't. Because when credit tightens, or payments shrink, or markets wobble again, there is no buffer left in the cash system. Only assets that can't be easily sold, and expectations that were built for a world that no longer exists. And that pressure doesn't stop at the farm gate. And this is where you enter the story. Because when agriculture tightens, it doesn't announce itself. It passes quietly from the field to the town, from the balance sheet to daily life. If you live in a rural community, you already feel it. The family farm that doesn't change hands because it can't. The land that gets rented out, then managed remotely. The young farmer who wants in but can't clear the first barrier. Higher land prices don't mean higher opportunity. They mean higher rent, higher risk, less room for mistakes. And when farmers lose flexibility, communities lose resilience, fewer local suppliers, fewer independent businesses, more consolidation, less voice, You don't see it in national GDP, but you see it in who stays and who leaves. If you care about food security, this matters. If you care about rural stability, this matters. If you care about who controls the land beneath your economy, this matters. And if this perspective resonates with you, if you want analysis that connects policy to real lives, share this video. Because the next part expands the lens. What's happening here doesn't stop at America's borders. What's happening inside US agriculture is already rippling outward. Global food systems are tightly linked. When one major exporter stumbles, the effects don't stay local. They cascade. As US exports lose ground, other suppliers step in. Brazil, Argentina, Black Sea producers, supply chains reroute, ports, railways, and processing capacity follow the new flow. This reshapes geopolitics quietly but decisively. Food importing countries care about one thing above all: reliability. Not ideology, not alliance. Consistency. When trade becomes unpredictable, they don't wait for clarity. They diversify preemptively, they lock in alternatives, they reduce exposure. That's how market share is lost without a single dramatic collapse. At the same time, higher global food prices driven by inflation, logistics, and value-added goods hit cities hardest. Not farmers, consumers. Food doesn't get cheaper when trade fragments. It gets less efficient. And inefficiency always shows up on the grocery receipt. So the question isn't whether agriculture is doing fine. It's whether the system is drifting toward a world that is more fragile, more expensive, and harder to correct once it locks in. And that brings us to the future. Not as a prediction, but as a set of choices. There are three paths forward, not forecasts, scenarios. First, the stable adjustment. Trade tensions ease, markets reopen partially, government support tapers, but predictably. Producers adapt, margins remain thin but survivable. The system bends without breaking. Second, the managed stagnation. Trade friction becomes permanent. Payments replace markets as the stabilizer. Land values stay high. Entry stays closed. Production continues, but innovation slows. Agriculture survives, but loses dynamism. Resilience becomes dependence. And third, the hard reset. Support shrinks suddenly. Credit tightens. Another global shock hits weather, energy, geopolitics. Cash flow collapses before assets can adjust. Consolidation accelerates. Market power concentrates. Recovery takes a decade, not a season. None of these outcomes is inevitable, but all are plausible. The deciding factor isn't yield or technology or even prices. It's whether policy reinforces competitiveness or merely postpones reckoning. Whether trade is treated as leverage or as infrastructure. Whether signals are clarified or drowned out by relief. Systems don't fail when they're weak. They fail when they can't adapt. And that leaves one final question. What should we take from all of this right now? That's where we end. What this moment demands is not panic. It demands honesty. American agriculture is not collapsing, but it is drifting. Drifting toward a system where income is stabilized after the fact, where markets are replaced by compensation, where land appreciates faster than opportunity, where resilience is confused with endurance. That path looks calm until it isn't, because food systems are strategic systems. They rely on trust, on access, on the belief that supply will be there next year and the year after that. Once that belief erodes, no subsidy can buy it back quickly. The insight is simple but uncomfortable. You can shield producers from shocks, or you can strengthen the system to absorb them. Doing both indefinitely is impossible. Trade is not a weapon. It's infrastructure. Reliability is not generosity. It's strategy. If you want a food system that feeds people, supports farmers, and competes globally, the signals must be clear, the rules predictable, The market's open.